It's good to have you guys here today. I got to say hi to a few of you, but wish I could to all of you. But as much as I love seeing you, Sundays have to be God's favorite day. Around the globe, out of 8 billion people, there are a lot of people who gather on Sundays, just like you're doing today with me in his churches. Just to pause and just to focus on him, to worship him, to learn from him, to grow, to lean into him, to respond to him. I'm ecstatic you're here. He is even much more so. For some of you, this is your first time to the harbor. We're especially glad that you guys are here. We've spent the last 5 weeks on this subject of broken, about how every one of us human beings is broken, but how God says to us in our brokenness, come as you are. God's message has never been, in your brokenness, go fix yourself, go clean yourself up, then come to me. It's always been, in your brokenness, right where you are, come to me just as you are now. So we focus on how that brokenness might arise in our lives. And for some of us, maybe it's been in apathy. Maybe we've lacked passion around the things that we should have passion for. And we're broken in this apathy. Maybe others of us were broken in anger. And the things we were angered about, the way we expressed that anger, were broken in anger. Maybe others of us have been broken by broken dreams. And our very lives have been broken by our broken dreams. Things unrealized we'd hoped and prayed for. Maybe that's our brokenness. Maybe it's sexual brokenness. We could go on and on. But there's this ultimate brokenness that Jesus speaks to. He says it's the word lost. In essence, he's saying that in our sin, we are alienated from God. As people who are broken, people who sin, we're alienated from God. We're broken from relationship with him. He says we're lost, and he says if that isn't fixed, then that alienation, that lostness will go on from now into the life to come, into eternity. And he's saying, I came to this planet to take you who are lost, which is the whole planet, and bring you to the point of being found. And so today, I'm going to take a vivid, true story from ancient Israel and tell you the story. And in the story, you'll begin to see how Jesus can take us from brokenness and lostness to being found. So I'm going to give you a screen that has scriptures on it. I won't be reading the scriptures, but if you would like, take your phone out and take a picture of this slide. You'll have reference to these scriptures. But I'll be referring to these and talking through these. And part of what I'll do in the story I'll tell you, I will use careful judgment about the conversations that aren't recorded in Scripture, but there certainly were conversations. And I'll use careful judgment to decide to describe to you what is going on in someone's mind in that setting, because it's not described to us, but it'll fill out the story for us. So these are the passages that I'll use. So the essence of what we're going to cover is around something called covenant. So you and I have to know what covenant means. And in essence, a covenant is just an agreement between one person and another. It can be a very low risk covenant, very low commitment covenant. It could be 2 10-year-old boys riding bikes, and one saying to the other that if you let me ride your bike, I'll let you ride mine. That's a covenant. It's very low cost, not much at stake with that. But it could be a higher stake. It could be you going to someone who has apartments for rent, and you say to them, I will pay you X dollars for 12 months in exchange for living in this apartment. That's a high risk covenant, isn't it? In ancient Israel, there was a covenant of the highest engagement, highest risk. It was called blood covenant. It's called blood covenant. And in essence, one person would say to another, all that I am and all that I have, I give to you in exchange for all that you are and all that you have as well. That's blood covenant. Everything I have, everything about me in exchange for the same from you, I commit to you. So what it might look like if, where's Chris Taylor at? Right here. If Chris Taylor and I were in blood covenant, what it might look like would be, if he doesn't bail on me in this blood covenant, what it might look like would be if I'm at the emergency room at 2 a.m. and I don't have the funds to cover this emergency, I just call up Chris, we're in blood covenant. And I say, still with me, Chris? Bring your debit card, credit card, checkbook, whatever it takes, but no problem, we're in blood covenant, come bail me out. And he would, blood covenant. Maybe the shoe's on the other foot, and Chris and Kate get a call from South Carolina, and there's some emergency in South Carolina with the family, and they get 6 blocks towards South Carolina, and the car breaks down. No problem, we're in blood covenant. Chris calls me up and says, hey, we got stalled, got to go to South Carolina, no problem. I go to him, take my car, give him the keys, and say, here it is, blood covenant. All that I am, all that I have is yours in exchange for all that you are and all that you have as well. That's what blood covenant might look like. The people of Israel were a very visual people. They would build rituals that would give them, strong visions of what it might look like to be in something like blood covenant. So they had developed this covenant ceremony. You read part of it in 1 Samuel 18, gives you a frame of that. But the ceremony would include, if Chris and I were joining into this covenant, it would begin by me taking off my coat, which would symbolize who I am. I'd fold it up and give it to Chris and say, all that I am, I commit to you. He would take off his coat, fold it, give it to me with the same. After that, I would take off my belt, which was used in those days to hold up my weapons. I would give my belt to him and say, if you ever get in a fight, I will be there fighting with you. He would take off his belt and give it to me and say, if you ever get in a fight, I'll be there fighting with you. And then to build on that, I would take my sword and give it to him. And I would say, if the fighting gets really tough, I will bring everything I have to the fight. He takes his sword, gives it to me with the same words. And then to take it further, I would take my bow, like my last weapon, and give it to him and say, if you're in a fight, I will give everything I have to fight beside you. He'll take his bow, give it to me as well. Then Chris and I would take a lamb, or sometimes a goat. We would sacrifice the animal. We would cut it literally in half. We would put the 2 halves out apart with a gap between the 2. We would put the blood of the lamb in the gap. And I would walk through the blood of the lamb. And I would say to Chris, if it comes to it, I will actually die for you if it comes to that. And Chris would then walk through the blood of the lamb as well and say, if it comes to it, I would even die for you if it comes to that. And then he and I would take a knife and I would cut my hand until I drew blood. He would take the same knife, cut his hand until he drew blood. We would join our hands together like this until the blood flowed together. And I'd be saying, in life and in death, I am with you, I'm for you. He would say, in life and in death, I'm with you and I'm for you. And then we'd have this covenant meal, and almost certainly it'd be with friends and family, and maybe it'd be with the whole church crowd like this. And the meal, there'd be this great feast, but at the very center of it, there'd be a loaf of bread and a cup of wine. The loaf of bread would mean, this is my body committed to you. A cup of wine, this is my blood that I would shed for you. That would be the final piece of the covenant ceremony. So in 1 Samuel 18, we begin to meet the first 3 or 4 people involved in covenant. The first one we encounter is Saul, and he was king of Israel at this time, and Saul was a man. If you were to characterize him with a sentence, he could never quite bring himself to trust God. If God said, Saul, I want you to turn right here, Saul would think about it and often say, you know what, I really think the better path for me is left, and he would turn left over and over again. There's a time that Saul has his armies and they're going to fight a mighty foe. And God says, I will win the victory for you. When you've won the victory through me, just be sure you don't take any of the spoils of war. No livestock, no silver, no gold. So Saul takes his men, they enter into battle, and God gives him great victory. Within the hour coming down the road are sheep and goats and cattle and gold and silver. Saul could never quite bring himself to trust God. He believed that God didn't have the best for his life. Saul thought, I can better shape the life that I want to have. The second person is David, and he's the exact opposite of Saul. I mean, David could trust God so deeply. In fact, most of the time, When God would say to David, turn right, David would turn right. And the few times he didn't, he would come back to God in deep repentance, in deep sorrow. David believed that God had his best in mind at all times. So around blood covenant, Saul and David could never enter into that, could they? Amos chapter 3, verse 3 says, how can two walk together unless they be of like mind? Blood covenant would never work, would it? How could they ever enter into blood covenant? Third person that emerges in this chapter is Jonathan. He is Saul's son. And he's born into the family of Saul, but he is so unlike Saul. In fact, he's almost the identical twin of David in terms of his faith in God. He had this radical, wild faith in God. You might even say crazy. There's this one place where the Philistine army is having their way with the army of Israel. And Jonathan says to his armor bearer, he says, hey, you have to follow me, right? And the guy says, yeah, that's my job. And he says, good. Now it's going to be two of us against all of them. It's not just two of us, it's two of us and God. That's all that matters. And he attacks the Philistine army, the two of them. That's the kind of faith he had. He's so much like the person of David, the faith of David, deep radical faith in God. And when blood covenant is entered into, in this chapter 18, it's between David and Jonathan. In that chapter, it talks about taking the coat, the belt, the sword, the bow. It doesn't tell the whole thing, but it's saying this was blood covenant. And when they did that covenant, in Israel's covenant, there was this unique piece about it. It wasn't just all I am, all I have, for all you are, all you have, but it also was all of my kids. Hey, as long as they're children and all, then they're part of it. All that they are and all that you are, they're part of it as well. All of your kids, when they grow up, become adults, they can decide if they're in or out. But they're tied to this blood covenant as well, to the expectations and the benefits as well, until they're adults, and then they can choose. Do they want to be part of this covenant or not? So they enter into blood covenant. Some time passes, and David becomes this great warrior, a great hero in Israel. In fact, his fame eclipses the fame of King Saul, which becomes a big problem. Saul is very insecure, very jealous of David. And there comes a time in the palace where Saul is sitting there and he grabs his spear and he flings it at David to kill him. David dodges, avoids it. David runs, and basically the rest of Saul's life, he is chasing after David, trying to find him and kill David for the very rest of his life. So Saul would be out with his men, time after time, hunting for David. For another day, they would fail in the hunt. They would come back to the campfire. They would sit down, and Saul would say, David is after my throne. David wants to kill me and take my throne, and you can be sure of this. When he does that, he will take your life too. He will kill all of my children, all of my generals, all of my servants. Beware, never let him take my life, because yours will be taken next. He is your and my mortal enemy. Again and again and again. Years pass. Saul and his sons, including Jonathan, are killed in battle. 1 Samuel 31, 2 Samuel 4:4. They're killed by the Philistines, not by David, by the Philistines. They're killed in battle. Fear sweeps through the palace when word gets there. Panic and chaos ensue. Fear of the Philistine army, fear of David because of all of the warnings of Saul. Jonathan has this son named Mephibosheth. He's 5 years old. Someone picks up Mephibosheth to run in the chaos, trying to escape the fear of the Philistines and fear of David. They fall, and Mephibosheth damages his leg so badly he will never walk again. They sweep him away, take him to this rebel hideout called Lodabar, to hide out while the Philistines and David sort out the rule that's going to emerge from this. Eventually, David becomes king after many years, not by force, by the will of the people. People see him, they want him to be their king. He becomes king, and after he's become king and things have begun to settle, he's sitting around in the palace one day, and he says to those former servants of Saul, he says, can you tell me, does Jonathan have any children that have survived? I want to bless them. And the servants of Saul are thinking, yeah, we understand. Bless them, yeah, off with their head. We know, Saul told us. You want to kill every single one. This would happen from time to time, and finally, after enough time, one of the servants named Ziba, when David brings up again, just tell me, is there any survivor of Jonathan's family? And Ziba understands David's heart now. He says, yeah, actually there is. There's this one son named Mephibosheth, And he's living in this distant rebel hideout of Lodabar. And so David says, go get him. I want to bless him. And he sends his chariots crashing off and sends his soldiers thundering off to Lodabar to bring him back. Mephibosheth is in Lodabar. Lodabar means pastureless. It was this barren desert area. It was this worthless area where he lived. He grew up fearful of the day that David might come, fearful of the day that David's chariots might thunder in. He grew up cursing the name of David. He knew what David would be after if he ever met him. He grew up plotting if he only had the strength and power to find David first and kill David first, he would do so. So this day comes, he can hear the chariots thundering. He looks out, he sees there the chariots of the king. He hides in his hut as the soldiers hunt hut after hut after hut until they get to his, and he's defenseless. They pick him up, leaving his crutches behind. They set him in a chariot, and they thunder back to the palace where David is. They carry him in, they put him at the feet of David. His face is to the floor. David says, Mephibosheth, I've been looking for you. Mephibosheth says, I know. And then David says, I want to bless you. I want to give you all of the lands of your grandfather Saul. I want to give you all the lands of your father Jonathan. And more than that, I want to take you in as my son. I want you to live here in the palace with me as my son. Mephibosheth is so disoriented. His whole world has revolved around, if this moment ever comes, this means death for him. He thinks it's a joke. He waits and waits and no one's laughing. He looks up, he sees this sincerity in David's face. And then he says, I don't deserve this. You read the words, he says, I'm as worthless as a dead dog. I do not deserve what you've offered me. And David extends his palm for this scar. And he says, you don't know, do you, that I entered into blood covenant with your father Jonathan a long time ago. I vowed to your father all that I am, all that I have, in exchange for all that he was and all that he had as well. And you know how it works, you're his son. You're grown now, you have a choice, but I'm offering to you everything I have. I'm the king of Israel. All that I have, all that I am for you, in return for all that you are and all that you have. Mephibosheth has a decision, doesn't he? I mean, David's offered all of this, but he's saying to Lodabar, but you have to commit all that you are to me and all that you have to me. And Mephibosheth thinks, probably not for very long, but what does he have? He has Lodabar. He has this barren wasteland of Lodabar. And he looks up and says, yes, I will enter into and accept the covenant that you had between you and my father Jonathan. I will accept it as mine as well. So some servants pick him up. Again, crutches were left back in Lodabar. Pick him up and they carry him to the back and they begin to scrub off all the dirt and grime and stench of Lodabar. They give him new, clean clothes befitting of the son of the king. They ask if he's hungry, and he says, as a matter of fact, I'm famished. And they pick him up and they begin to carry him down the hallway, and he can smell the aroma of food, and he sees the servants' hall where they will eat, and he's surprised they don't turn into the servants' hall. They continue on further down the hall. They throw open a door. He sees this is the dining hall of the king. And there is food piled up as he's never even dreamed could exist. He looks to the end of the table, and there's King David sitting there. There are a number of other young men around the table. He assumes they are the sons of David. And there's this empty seat at the table, this seat of honor. It is his seat. Servants carry him over and set him down in his seat. And the food piled high, he's ravenous, and he almost loses sight of where he is. He begins to eat ravenously. Like a hungry wild animal, eating and eating and eating, and all of a sudden he stops. He thinks, this isn't right. I don't deserve this. I cursed him. I wanted to kill him. This isn't right. Just about that time, he looks, and David is extending his hand to take another leg of lamb, and he sees the scar. And he realizes it's not about deserving. It's covenant. It's the blood covenant. That meal is done, and he thinks, what a stunning welcome home gift. Then to his surprise, the next day comes and there's another meal just like that. Same feast, he has the same place at the table, and the next day, and the next day. This is just life with the king. Many, many, many days passed, maybe many weeks passed, and he's finished one of these feasts that he's been in the midst of day after day. Now he has crutches, he's going down the hallway, a couple of servants pull him aside and say, we know who you really are. You're the biggest fraud, biggest hypocrite of this entire palace. We know who you are. We know how you cursed him. We know how you planned to kill him. You're a fraud, you're a fake, you're a hypocrite. You know what his answer is? You don't know the half of how bad I am. You don't know how badly I wanted to take his life. But it's not about deserving. Have you ever looked at David's palm and seen the scar in his hand? It's all about blood covenant. It is all about blood covenant. The story I've told you is a true story. There really was a man named Mephibosheth. He really lived in the desert, barren town of Lodabar. There really was a day that the king's chariot showed up and took him back to the kingdom. There really was a day he had an option. He could opt out. He could continue with life. He could make his own life, his own world, his own Lodabar. He's given this option to become a son of the king, and he accepted it, and it changed everything. Hey, could you imagine, put yourself in his shoes? Can you imagine if you were there 3,000 years ago living in that and that happened for you? I mean, there's no lottery in America big enough to encompass that, is there? I mean, the radical life change that he experienced. So there's a second true story, and it parallels the first true story. And like the first story, there were 4 characters in that story. There are 4 players in this story, and you're one of the players. And this story is unfolding even as I speak. The first player is God the Father. He's the creator of everything, perfect in every way. All knowledge, all wisdom, all power, all grace, all love, and yet just in every way. Hates sin, loves what is righteous, loves what is good. Second player is the human race, lumped together, which would include you and me. So much like Saul, aren't we? The human race, never quite being able to trust God the Father that he's really good. Always taking his direction, his commands, his orders with this big pause, and we assess for ourselves, is that really what's best for me or not? He says, go right, let me process it for myself. If I agree, then I'll go right. If not, I'll go left. Isn't that the case of the human race? The thought is, I really know better than God does about my life. If God ever got a hold of my life, it wouldn't be nearly as good as I can make on my own. In fact, it might not even be a life worth living. In the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament is this living proof that you and I, the human race, could never enter into blood covenant with God the Father. How can 2 walk together if they're not like-minded? We could never enter into covenant with God the Father, could we? No chance. The third player, though, is Jesus, who is God the Son. And he's born into the family of man, but so unlike the family of man. Much like Jonathan. You're born into the family of Saul, but not like the family of Saul at all. Jesus, born into this family of man. So like God that he could say, if you've seen me, you've seen God the Father. So like God, Colossians says, he is the visible image of the invisible God the Father. Where you and I could never enter into covenant with God the Father, he could. So there came a day, Matthew 26 describes this, where he sat with his closest followers, and he had the covenant meal. He took the bread, representing his body. He took the cup, representing his blood. He had the covenant meal. And then he didn't merely take a knife and cut his hand until he drew blood. He allowed spikes to be driven completely through his hands and feet. He didn't take a lamb and sacrifice it and shed its blood. He became the lamb. He didn't say, if I ever need to die for you, I will. He did die fighting for us. He committed to blood covenant with the Father and Son in blood covenant. And we are the fourth person in the story. We are Mephibosheth, and Jesus is our Jonathan. Because of Jesus' covenant with God the Father, we have access to the very same covenant. But we have a choice. We can accept God saying, all that I am and all that I have will be yours in exchange for all that you are and all that you have. And we have a choice, don't we? There's going to be something that we give up. We give up this autonomy. All that we have becomes his. We might process that and think about that and consider that if we give up, we're giving up our Lodabar, where we craft the best life we can. We're crafting something more than God could craft, we would think. We would be giving up our Lodabar. And so most of us, for a long time, we run from God to our Lodabar. And we try to make the Lodabar better and better and sweeter. We just hope that God never catches us there. We hope he never shows up there, because if he does, the Lodabar's done. But he always catches up with us. Every one of us he catches up with. Maybe it's in a hospital room in a time of great crisis, and you sense God is meeting you there in that place. Some of you, I know it's been in an extreme act of kindness you've experienced from someone toward you, and you felt God showing up in that place and meeting you in that place. Some of you, as many others before you, you are sensing that right now in this worship service. He's caught up with you now. He is here in this place. And he's extending this offer fresh to you. So I invite you into covenant with me. All that I am and all that I have is yours, in exchange for all that you are and all that you have. He's saying, I know you're broken. I know your sin. I know your failures. I know all that. I'm not asking you to change anything. I'm asking you to come as you are. Enter into covenant with me just as you are. Bring to me all that you are and all that you have. There's this moment of surrender that has to happen. Say, I'll give up my Lodabar. And if you take stock of your Lodabar, I don't care how big your house is. Don't care how many cars you have. Don't care how big your stock portfolio is. It is still stinking Lodabar in comparison to the King of the universe and his kingdom. He's saying to you, will you meet me here? Will you enter into blood covenant with me and accept this? I will give you all that I am, all that I have, in exchange for all that you are and all that you have. And when you take that step, there's not this instant change where the brokenness is all gone and you never break again, you never have sin again. It's not that at all. In Hebrews 8, verses 8 through 10, it begins to spell out the old covenant, the Old Testament covenant that we always failed at. It says now there's this new covenant, and God begins to give you a brand new heart, a new mind, and there's this gradual change that begins to happen. I was reminded as I was looking at this of a friend to follow Jesus that was about a year into following Jesus. And a conversation we had, the friend said, I am so angry at myself. And I said, why? And he said, well, because of this sin and this sin and this sin. And I said, I'm thrilled. And he said, why are you thrilled? I just told you about these sins. I said, I'm thrilled because you're so angry about them. You are leaning into this covenant with God. You're becoming more and more like him. You hate the sin. You're longing to abandon the sin. There's this gradual change that happens and takes place. And there's a point in time where you begin to recognize you're at God's table, when you sense this peace permeating when you never knew it before. There's joy unexpected in a circumstance you have never expected joy. It's permeating. You're at his table again. You sense a purpose for your life beyond anything you could have dreamed of, and you're at his table again. You sense his power at work in you and in others around you. Friends, we are all Mephibosheth. We're all in need of Jesus to have entered into covenant with God the Father. And only on following on his heels, on saying, Jesus, because of you, I have access to being part of this covenant as well. I have access to a brand new life and all that the God of this universe is and brings to it. And all I have to give up is my autonomy and my Lodabar. We're all Mephibosheth. A lot of you here, you've made the exchange. You said to God, I surrender. I give you all that I am, all that I have in exchange for all that you are and all that you have. Celebrate that today. Celebrate the life you're living. But a number of you until today, you have never made that surrender. You've never said, God, I hear the invitation. You know me, you know my brokenness, you know all about me. You know my Lodabar. And yet, God, because of Jesus, you invite me to this covenant, and I accept it. I surrender to you. I will give you all that I am and all that I have. And I know in that, then I will have all that you are and all that you have as well. And in that one decision, the ultimate brokenness being lost is discarded. The ultimate healing of being found is the description of your life now, found in God, found in Jesus. Close your eyes for just a few moments. Close your eyes and bow your head. Then ponder what side of this blood covenant you're on. Ponder if you're still in Lodabar. And you realize, like, the God of the universe loves me enough. He caught up with me here today, this day. The God of the universe knows me and loves me, even in my brokenness. And even in this moment, he's extending to me the offer of covenant. And all I have to do is just agree. I will give you all I have, all I am. And I will take all you are and all I am as well. And in that moment of surrender, you are hardwired into his covenant. You're part of the blood covenant. New life begins. You can only get there, though. You can't on your own power get to that table. It's like Mephibosheth. We have to be carried to the table by God's grace.